When you eat a cake, do you enjoy the cake, its taste, its texture? Or you try to figure out the intention of the baker when he was trying to bake the cake? When you drive a car, do you enjoy the drive, the comfort, the technology? Or you try to obsess over what the engineers were trying to create when they were creating and designing that car? We generally enjoy things for what they are and not for what their creators were trying to do, what their creators' intentions were at the time of creation of those things. So when it comes to reading a poem, why is it that we get so obsessed over what the poet was trying to say when he created the poem, rather than just trying to find meaning, trying to find pleasure in the act of reading itself through the poem's structure, language, devices, and formal aspects? This is what new critics W.K. Wimsatt and Monroe C. Beardsley highlighted through their term intentional fallacy, which is the topic for today's video. I welcome you all. Let's begin the lecture. It was the 1940s. Universities all across America had this weird trend where in English departments, the teachers would come to class, talk about an author's personal life, his political inclinations, his historical backgrounds, his ailments and personal problems, and consider the work done without even accessing, without even engaging with the text. Now you know that the new critics and the movement New Criticism was completely against this kind of criticism. They wanted literary criticism to be more objective, more scientific, more fact-based. So Wimsatt and Beardsley wrote an essay called The Intentional Fallacy, in which they coined this term. And this essay was later added to their book The Verbal Icon in 1946. Basically, Wimsatt and Beardsley say this one thing: expecting to arrive at the true meaning of a poem by accessing the author's intentions is an error, a fallacy, a mistake, and readers, critics, and teachers should avoid this fallacy. In other words, the new critics, including Wimsatt and Beardsley, were trying to say, guys, stop gossiping about the author's personal life and just read the damn text. And that's why Wimsatt and Beardsley argued that a critic should focus only on the text itself, and everything else, including the author's intention, should be treated as irrelevant. This way, interpretation will become more objective, more fact-based, instead of being subjective, emotional, and, let's be honest, totally random. So by now you understand this one thing, that Wimsatt and Beardsley believed that it is a mistake to understand that the true meaning of a poem or a novel or a play lies in what the author intended to say. But why is it a mistake? Well, first of all, Wimsatt and Beardsley say that once a work is written, it becomes independent of the author's private thoughts. It becomes like a public monument, like the Taj Mahal. Once built, it belongs to the people, the visitors. Similarly, a poem, once created, is independent of the author's private thoughts. It becomes a public monument, and each reader would derive a separate kind of pleasure in reading it. Each reader may derive different meanings from the language of the poem. Further, Wimsatt and Beardsley believe, and I quote, the design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art. Now, this quote, although it sounds heavy, basically says just three simple things. We should not take into account the author's intention because, number one, the author's actual thoughts are not available to us. The intentions are unavailable. Obviously, we cannot sit inside Shakespeare's head when he was creating Hamlet. We cannot understand what thoughts he was going through when he wrote the soliloquy to be or not to be. Similarly, we cannot say what John Keats was thinking when he was writing Ode to a Nightingale. Was he longing for death? Was he just bored? Was he just casually looking at a bird and he thought, wow, that's a nice bird. I should write a poem on that bird. We would never know what the author was thinking. Writing is a complicated process, and to access the author's creation of that literary art is not really possible. So the author's intentions are not available to us unless, of course, you have a time machine and you have telepathy skills. Now you might say, of course, we can sometimes access what the author was trying to say. We can read their biography, letters, journals, diaries, personal notes, and sometimes we can also interview them and ask them what they were thinking. So comes the second thing we get from Wimsatt and Beardsley's quote, which is the author's intention is unreliable. You cannot really trust an author's intention even when he tells you what he was trying to do. We cannot fully trust it because authors sometimes forget. Sometimes they oversimplify and sometimes they just mess with us. They don't give us the direct answers, they don't give us the accurate information. And even when they're trying to give us the intentions and the correct information, sometimes writing is also an unconscious process. So an author may not find the correct words to explain how he was feeling, what he was feeling at the time of creating that work. So the author's intention might not be reliable. For example, T.S. Eliot ends his book The Wasteland with the words Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. It is the last line of that poem. It seems like saying Shanti, 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 which is another three repetitions of the word peace, it seems like some final note of potential hope is offered. Some hope for spiritual renewal is offered. Some peace is offered at the end of the poem because the poem was dealing with a lot of spiritual and cultural decay. But Eliot, in his notes to the book, just tells us one thing, that this phrase means the peace which passeth understanding. So Eliot picks up a dense, heavy Hindu concept and flattens it into a vague Christianized phrase, which is totally unhelpful. And fun fact, Eliot partly added those notes because his publishers wanted a longer book. So yeah, can we rely on Eliot's intentions to know what he meant by those words? Not really. So, the author's personal material may not be as helpful as you expect it to be. All right? The third reason why Wimsatt and Beardsley believe that aiming to capture the author's intention is a mistake is because it is unnecessary. You know that the new critics believe that a work of literature is self-dependent, it's autonomous, it's independent, it's self-sufficient, it's adequate. We don't need outside information to understand a work of literature. All right? So even if we somehow had full access to the author's intention, we don't really need it. A work of literature speaks for itself through its formal aspects. Our job as readers and critics and teachers is to engage with the words, the structure, the imagery, the rhythm, and not the private thoughts of the author. We are not concerned with that. For example, when you read Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken and you read these lines, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Most readers find these lines deeply moving, deeply encouraging. They feel that they have a meaningful message of individualism. But here's the twist. In a 1915 letter to his friend Edward Thomas, Frost admitted that this poem was partly a joke about him, about the friend, about Edward Thomas. And he was joking about Thomas's indecisiveness on their walks. Frost even said that Thomas took the poem too seriously and their friendship soured because of it. Imagine losing a friend because you trolled him in verse. So if we go only by Frost's intention, it was just to create a teasing private joke. But the poem continues to impact us, to move us, to encourage us with its language, with its structure, with its rhythm, with its symbolism. And that's why Wimsatt and Beardsley ask us to focus on the text, because the author's intentions are unavailable, unreliable, and unnecessary. In other words, meaning should not be hunted down in the poet's letters, diaries, interviews. Instead, we should ask these three things. Number one, how do the words on the page interact with each other? What ideas does this interaction generate? What ideas come to your mind when words interact in that manner? What formal features of the poem, like the rhyme scheme, the rhythm, the metaphors used, the imagery, paradox, tension, ambiguity, how these formal features of the work make the poem what it is, how this generates meaning, how this enhances our understanding and the pleasure we derive from the poem. In short, Wimsatt and Beardsley shift our focus from what the poet meant to what the poem means as a self-contained work of art. And in this way, they are asking us to keep literary criticism separate from mind reading. So that's it for the lecture. I hope you understood intentional fallacy, which sounds like such a difficult term, but is actually very simple. If you did understand this, if this video helped you, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.